Hello again and very welcome to the chapter about using pins. I would say that from all the motifs within chess tactics, pins hold exceptional importance. It's one of the first things that we learn about as beginners, but actually they keep having big importance. They remain present in the tactical battle on all levels. We're speaking about pins on files, diagonals, and ranks. We're speaking about bishops, queens, and rooks carrying out the pin, so to speak. There are different kinds of pins. Some of them are evident and others are more difficult to discover or to notice. And here I would like to show you some different cases regarding how we can use pins in order to improve our defensive task, so to speak. Let's start with the first example. This is a game, a late middle game with the white piece is Korneev and playing black is Flom. As you can see, white is playing for an attack. There is the open H file. If it's white to play, what do you think they would like to do? That's right, of course, they would like to play queen h5. In this way they will be able to invade along the h-file. Moves like queen h8 and rook h7 would come up. Black's king would be in huge danger. We can see that there are not many pieces on black's kingside right now. So safe to say they will have to do something very clever here in order to keep the balance. At the same time, since this is the chapter about using pins, you have of course already noticed that there is a pinned piece on the board. Aha, the knight on f3 is pinned. We have this pin along the a8, h1 diagonal. And usually when we come across pins in tactics books and so on, there is a focus on taking the piece, on capturing the pinned piece. Black would like to bring another piece to attack that knight. Perhaps there is a bishop on c8 that we could put on b7 and so on. But here I'm rather speaking about something else. I'm referring to the fact that a pinned piece, such as the knight in this case, it loses great part of its functionality because it cannot move, which means that we can somehow exploit the situation to our favor. And that's what happened in the game. Black cannot really prevent the move queen h5. However, they can limit the rook on h1. And I think by now you already know which is the right move here. Of course, black played here rook d4. Of course, this move would not be possible if the knight was not pinned on f3. So we are like using this pin along the h1, a8 diagonal. And after white's reply queen h5, we will actually do it again. That's correct. We have to bring the rook to the h-file to restrict white's rook on h1. This is how the game went. There was simply no other choice for black. In the game, white took on h4, black took back, and at this point of the battle, you can see that problems are probably over for black. They are even having a slight initiative here because their pawn on c5 is ready to run, and also the pin itself remains very useful for black because white cannot bring the knight to the attack as they would have liked to. What happened in the game was that Korneev noticed that he was actually in trouble here with white, and he hurried to build up counterplay. If you remember, we talked about using passed pawns as a way of distracting the opponent, and that's what happened here. He played a5. Black continued with their pawn c4, and after b6, a takes b6, a takes b6, c3. At this point, since the pawn is getting closer and closer, white wisely decided to bring the queen a little closer to the queening square. So they played queen g4 check. After king f7, queen f4, white kept the balance. Black went back with the king, and at this point, white simply gave check again, and the game was a draw, as simple as that. So let's see this simple example from the beginning again. We had this position. Black noticed that there was the threat of queen h5 and queen h8 and so on. They didn't want to allow that. They couldn't bring a piece to rescue the king, so to speak. So they decided to bring in the rook, using the fact that the knight on f3 cannot move by playing here the move rook d4. And after queen h5, rook h4, problems were basically over for black in this case. So simple yet useful example, I think. Please notice again that we're not talking about trying to win this knight somehow, pushing g4, something like that. It's more about exploiting this restricted piece. All right, we will take a next example. So if this was rather simple, our next example will be a bit more difficult. So in the previous example, we had a pin taking place on a diagonal, but this time we will talk about a pin along the open file. At this point, there is no pin. But you will soon see what I'm referring to. We have this game between Gajewski with the white pieces and André Nielsen playing black. Black has just played a clever move here, rook e4. Speaking about strategy, when you're sitting with a IQP, like in this case the pawn on d5, using these two squares is a clever idea, typical pattern. Very often knights, they settle on those squares, but here black played rook e4. So what's going on here is that black is attacking the knight on f4, right? And at the same time, what black intended here was that if white takes on e4 after d takes e4, suddenly the d file opens towards white's queen, and also black's pawn structure is improved. So not so easy for white to handle this position. In the game, they made a huge mistake. The Polish grandmaster made a mistake here. He played knight takes g6. And as I was saying to you, pins are all over the place. They are more important than we might think initially. So already here there are a few pins that we should try to establish. I think that when he played knight takes g6, his idea was that if f takes g6, he would take on e4. And here you can see, since the f pawn is not around anymore, now the pawn on d5 is pinned. So black would have to take back with the queen on e4 instead. And white would, of course, take on d4 with a solid extra pawn. However, after knight takes g6, black found a much stronger move. They used another pin to their favor. They played here the move queen g4. Very clever, because as you can see, not only are we attacking the knight on g6, but we're also exploiting the pin along the g file. We are now threatening to play knight f3 check. So this is perhaps something that white overlooked in the game. I think there is no easy solution for them anymore. For example, if knight e5, I think black would just take on e5, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. So if you now take on e5, again we have knight f3 check. On the other hand, if we take on d4, black would take on d4, exploiting the overloaded rook on d1. So this is what's happened in the game. I mean, queen g4 happened in the game, and white had big troubles, and actually black went on to win here. So this is something to be avoided with white. Knight takes g6, it's a good idea, but it has this problem that black can play queen g4 and rely on this pin on the g file with the fork on f3. So what else could we possibly play here? You could try something like knight e3, retreating the knight, but again, this move queen g4 would be annoying for white. You have again the threat of knight f3. So what to do then? Well, since we're talking about pins, this is about how we can bring up a pin on the board, how we can create a pin. So actually the right move is the counterintuitive move rook takes e4. This is evidently something that white shies away from in the first place, because after d takes e4, suddenly there is the threat of knight f3. But this is the key moment. When there are rooks on the same file, there are different pinning scenarios, you could say. If one piece, it can be whites or blacks, ends up on that same file, well, there are two rooks. Evidently, we're speaking about some kind of pinning scenario. And that's what can happen here. Again, we should not take on g6 this time, because black would play knight f3 check, and after pawn takes, rook takes, you can see that in the end, after white takes the black queen, black will take the white rook and so on. So this is not healthy for white. However, there is a very clever move here. A very clever move. I will give you a hint. You should give away a piece momentaneously for the moment, and then you will get it back. That's right. We can play here a nice move, knight d5. No blame on Gajewski for not seeing this in the game. It's not evident at all until you see it, of course, because what's going on here is that if black takes on d5, here we have the key idea that white is using here. Queen takes d4, and as you can see, now it's black who is having a big tactical problem. The bishop is pinned on the d file, and it cannot be defended properly. On top of it, white also has this pass pawn that we didn't talk about in the first place. So definitely this is very difficult for black, this position. So what to play after knight e5? Probably black will have to forget about taking that knight on d5. moves like e3 should always be considered in the tactical battle. We're talking about intermediate moves, which somehow involves some kind of change on the position. However, in this case, white would take with a pawn, and it wouldn't really make sense for black. We would keep the same idea in mind. Queen takes d4. So after knight d5, black's best move here would be to retreat the knight, and it should take care of the rook so that there is no check like knight f6 and queen takes d8. So for that reason, the knight should go to e6. But this is already a small victory for white because they have avoided the attack that they faced in the game, or the tactical difficulties that they faced in the game. Good move here would be queen e3 so that we step out of the pin with our queen. And what will black play here? Yeah, knight f4 would be nice for them to work on the pin. Now we're back to the, the schoolbook tactics, attack the pin and so on, the pinned piece. However, white could play g3, and now we have another tactical issue here. The queen is under attack, so that doesn't work. So probably black would have to take. Yeah, I was just thinking. I think the situation here is that white is about to play g3, and then perhaps give check on f6. So probably this is a good moment for black to take on d5. However, after white takes back, by the way, how would you take back? Would you take with the bishop or would you take with the rook? That's right. If we take with the bishop, we actually end up pinned again. We should avoid this if possible. And now you can see that the bishop is pinned, and black could try to find a way to attack that bishop, perhaps using the queen, something like that. And they will also be targeting the rook on d1. So definitely it's better to take with the rook so that we don't have to worry about pins anymore, at least for the near future. Perhaps black will take back and we take back, and definitely white is at least not worse here. White is probably better because we have this nice passed pawn, and also the bishop looks a bit stronger than the knight at this point. Queen h5 perhaps, again glancing at the d1 square, so that explains our best move. You got it. We should play safely here, bishop e3, and white keeps a nice advantage. So difficult example if you ask me, not evident at all. In the first place, it's psychologically difficult to play a move like rook takes e4. We feel like we're doing a favor to our opponent. And secondly, tactically, we have to see this important method, knight e5, helping to pin the opponent, so to speak, creating a pin against them. So this is a very nice move, nice trick. I have seen it before in other shapes. This always causing some kind of surprise effect. Knight e5 with a key idea that if bishop takes d5, we have queen takes d4 and black is pinned along the d file. All right, let's continue. I have another very complex example, but I think it's very interesting. It takes place in the Grunfeld defense. This is a game between two very strong grandmasters, Ragor with white from Austria and Volokitin from Ukraine with the black pieces. This is, for the trained eye, it's a typical case of the Grunfeld. You can see that white has played a system involving bishop e3, and there was a trade of queens on d2, and after that white has quickly brought other pieces into the game, and it already looks a bit dangerous for black. At first sight, yeah, nobody would like to be in black's shoes here. You can see that all white's pieces are very active, and speaking of pins, we can see that the knight on e7 is pinned along the e-file, which makes it difficult for black to just castle away, you would think. Let's speak about white's threats here. One key threat, of course, bishop c5, attacking the pinned piece. Another one might be to play d6 at some point, although we should notice that also there are pinning possibilities for black on the d-file. I think this is a theoretical position, and what Volokitin played in the game was bishop takes f3, hoping to ruin white's pawn structure, and later on perhaps, I'm not completely sure what was the trace of thought here, but perhaps trading off white's knight would mean that they have some less possibilities. Now, there is, for example, one idea for white to play knight h2 at some point, attacking the bishop on g4. So he was hoping to weaken white's pawn structure and perhaps later on try to castle away. However, Ragor found a very nice move here, bishop c5. He didn't care about the bishop on f3. It's more important to eliminate the knight on e7, which means that white's passed pawn could later on advance. So this is what happened in the game. black castle at this point. We take with the bishop so that we can put the pawn on d6, and this will defend each other mutually. Very nice idea in general in the endgame, pawn and bishop defending each other. After bishop takes g2, rook e3, rook fc8, white played d6, and this was very dangerous for black, very difficult for black. Key idea in the Grunfeld with white pushing the d pawn. That's always something that black should be careful about, not to allow. So this was difficult for black, and white later prevailed in this game. However, what they could have done, which was difficult because it looks like a clear mistake, they could actually have castled here straight away. So doesn't this invite the move bishop c5? Isn't this just losing material? Well, it is in fact losing material, but not as much as you might expect it would, because at this point what black can do, they can take advantage of the pinning motif along the d file. Very surprising move. I would say that if you play the Grunfeld, you should be ready for this kind of tactical complications, because it's very, very common. It's a more open opening, you could say, like the open center and so on, which means that there is a lot of tactics going on. Knight takes d5, very, very surprising move. What's going on here is that black will lose the exchange, but they will actually reach a very nice position thanks to their bishop pair. Let's see this in concrete terms. After bishop takes f8, we will just take back. It's probably best to take with the rook so that the bishop remains on the long diagonal. We take with the rook here. Don't take with the king, by the way. Yeah, I should mention that also. If you take with the king, white has this nice move, knight e5. And the thing is that white will take on g6 with check if black plays bishop e6. This is an important tactical detail. So for that reason, we should take on f8 with the rook, keeping our king and bishop in the best possible places. If this situation remains, black will be perfectly fine. They have already a pawn for the exchange, and the white king is in the center. So this is nice for black. So of course, knight takes d5, sorry, bishop takes d5, it's the key moment here. If white tries knight e5 in similar fashion to the previous line, black can now play bishop e6 differently to the other line. Knight takes d6 doesn't come with check. So what do you think black would play here? You're completely right. Rook d8. That's a cold shower for white. They don't have a good place to put their king now, as you can see. If they move the king this way, we could just take, because in that case the bishop is not attacked anymore. And if they go that way, we could, I think among other things, just give check and then pick up the knight that way. So small tactical nuances which are very important to see through. Let's check the most evident continuation here. Bishop takes d5, and of course black will play rook d8. We're using this pin in order to escape from this difficult tactical situation. So if we are able to get back the piece, we will be doing fine, because we have the bishop pair and we have a pawn already for the exchange. So the question is, can white somehow hold on to this extra piece? Well, we will look at the move rook c5. That would be the only way for white, technically speaking, to defend the bishop. And here you have to be a little careful. I have used this as an exercise. It's an interesting position. It shows you the richness of tactics in general, because you have like two approaches here. Either you could attack the bishop on d5, the pinned bishop on d5, or you could try to deflect the rook on c5 from the defense of the bishop. So which one do you think is right? Would you attack the pinned piece, or would you deflect the piece that is defending it? Not an easy thing to answer quickly, but if we look a little into the tactics, you can see here the difference. If we play bishop e6, which looks very logical, we actually lose the game, because white has a very beautiful combination here. Rook takes e6, and after f takes e6, it's time for a pretty strike. We would like to deflect black's rook from the d file to a specific square. Aha, you got it. Rook c8. Very pretty, because now after they take, we take, and we end up with an extra piece. So for that reason, if they play rook c5, don't play bishop e6. Try to attack this rook instead. I think you can go b6, or perhaps also you could play bishop f8. And in this case, as you can see, white can definitely not keep on protecting the bishop, because this would just be a terrible self-goal. Yeah, complete disaster here after bishop b4, so many pieces hanging at this point. So After rook d8, white's objectively best choice is just to give back the piece, playing something like rook e3 here, so that after rook takes d5, they can interpose with rook d3. Do you think black should trade, or should they keep the rooks on? That's completely correct. Whenever you have the minus exchange, it's possibly the best choice to keep those rooks on, keep your second rook on. So rook a5 would be the best choice, or rook b5 perhaps. But we only have one rook, so we should keep that rook on the board. They have two, so they are not affected if one of the rooks leave the board. They have another rook which is doing the same things as the other rook. So rook a5, black has counterplay. We have a safe square for the king if we are checked and so on. Yeah, I'm not sure who is better here. I wouldn't have any issues playing with the black pieces. So what happened here in this very difficult, complex theoretical battle from the Grunfeld is that black was in big danger. There was the threat of bishop c5. There was also d6. However, there is this very nice solution. Give away. First, we give away, after castles, bishop c5. First, we give away the exchange, you could say. If bishop takes d5, of course, rook d8 would come. White would take on f8 first, but we would take back with the rook, and after bishop takes e5, we are using this pin to our advantage. Not easy at all, but a typical pattern to remember, especially if you're a Grunfeld player. All right, we will continue, and I wanted to show you also an example where the pin takes place on a rank in a horizontal way, so to speak. So in this game, with the white pieces Solak and playing black Yilmaz, you can see that after black's last move here, queen g4, black is trying to cook up an attack on the king side. Queen g4 means that the bishop can take on f6. However, doing that would be a bad idea for white because black would take back, threat of mating 1, and if g3, evidently white is getting mated. So this would be disastrous. We have to avoid that. So what white should consider here is some move perhaps which keeps the situation the way it is. We cannot move the knight because then we're losing the bishop. So could you think of a pin somehow? Is there any pin perhaps taking place in a horizontal way here? You're completely right. That's the move that Solak used in the game. Rook d4. Very nice game. Game also, but a very nice move, because now we are making this move impossible because we're hitting the queen with check, and at the same time you can see that we are ready to take now, and this pawn on e4 is becoming a weakness for black. So after rook d4, black tried here queen h5, unpinning the pawn on e4, but this is already a small victory for white, that black's queen has left the g file. White took on f6, now that there is no issue with mate on g2 anymore. Black took back. As you can see, we're happy that the queen is not attacking the pawn anymore. And at this point, white hurried to take on e8. You could see that white is very close to queening this pawn, but there is a dangerous threat, obviously, rook e1. So what do you think at this point would be the best way for white to cope with that threat? How to prevent rook e1 check? That's right, we can actually use another pin to our favor. Apart from preventing rook e1, we can, by means of this move, also limit black a little more. Now they cannot take on g2 anymore because their queen is hanging. So very nice move, queen d1, very simple. Black is definitely losing track of their attack. They played queen g6 and white just took on f3. After rook e1, king h2, white was completely winning here. They have an extra pawn, and you can see that it's actually black's king which is in biggest danger at this point, not to speak of this strong passed pawn which is looming forward. So nice example, I would say. Nice game by Solak. Rook d4, very technical move, limiting the opponent's counterplay, using this pin of the pawn along the fourth rank in order to put some more pressure on black and make sure that the queen moves away from the g file. All right, let's have a look at an example taking place with less material on the board. Pins remain important also in the endgame or in later stages of the game. Technically speaking, this is not an endgame perhaps, or it's about move 20, but some early simplification led to this position. So it's up to your definition. What is an endgame? It takes place early in the game, but there are not many pieces, so perhaps it's an endgame after all. Anyway, let's see if we can understand this position. White has just played a move d6. Very clever move, you would say, because the passed pawn is getting closer to the queening square. There are some ideas like, for example, if black plays king e6, hitting the knight on f5, what do you think white would play in that case? That's right, we can play this nice move, rook c8. We talked a little about the back rank in chapter 4. I was saying that one of the situations where the back rank becomes really important is when we can immobilize our opponent's pieces, like in this case, paralyze their pieces, pin along the 8th rank or 1st rank. That's a key feature in some situations. So this would be very bad for black, but please notice that after king takes f5, d7, you might say that white already won the game, but you should have a last look at this move. That's right, we should just move the king. I was just checking your reflexes here. Yeah, don't take, because then we can come back into the battle. So yeah, we should play king f1 and white is winning. Black is unable to both save the rook and avoid the pawn from queening. But this didn't happen in the game, because in this game between Adiban with the white pieces and Salem playing black, Salem quickly noticed that there is like, what can I say? There is something beyond what we see in the first place. In the first place, we would see that bishop takes d6 fails to rook d1. That would be like the simple way to understand this position. But if you look a little further, like we were discussing, sometimes when there are two rooks on the same file, there can be pins working in favor of both sides. So right now, black is pinned, but there is a way in which we can turn the tables here. Of course, you have already seen it. We can play here king e6, so that if white takes on d6, it's actually them who get pinned after rook d8. Very clever idea by black. Here they would be basically winning, or yeah, much better at least, because they will end up with an extra pawn. So this didn't happen in the game. After king e6, Adiban wisely gave check on g7 instead, and after king d7, knight f5, king e6, we're repeating moves, and the game was soon drawn. So interesting example, very simple, perhaps something about looking a little beyond what you see in the first place. Please don't be too sentimental here. Don't think that if this is impossible due to that and end of story. That's not like chess works, right? We always have to be a little suspicious that there might be something more beyond what we see in the first place. And in this case, what Salem noticed was that he can play here king e6. Yeah, we have to play this move first, of course. You cannot start with rook d8, because in that case, white would take with the rook instead. While in this case, taking with the rook just lets us take on f5. So tactics works in black's favor here. In this case, very clever move, bishop takes d6. It looks bad, but it's actually very strong, because we can turn the pin against white in the very end. All right, let's check something which is definitely an endgame. This is a nice trick that I think all of us we have all faced it at some point, we have used it. And if that's not the case, well, you will learn something important here, because in this endgame between Belia with white and David playing with the black pieces, you can see that black is in trouble. If it's white to move, white will just take on a2 with a rook, and they should win this game without much difficulty. They have a clean extra piece. However, it's black to move, and you can find the best move by simply asking yourself, how would white like to take back on a2? Is it fine to take in both ways, with the rook or with the bishop, or would they prefer to take in one of these ways? And the answer is simple, of course. White doesn't want to take with the bishop, because if they take with the bishop, then they are self-pinning themselves, right? Then the bishop could not move, and the rook could not move either, because they would be in this nasty pin. So that's what David noticed at the board and played here. Nice move, rook a5. So what's going on here? We are simply forcing them to take with the bishop on a2 instead of taking with the rook. You can also play, by the way, rook d3 in similar fashion. The important thing is not to give them time to take on a2 with a rook. So rook a5, that's what he played in the game. If now bishop takes a2, we would play rook a3 most probably. As you can see, these pieces aren't really working. The only way for white to help them would be to bring the king to protect the rook, but in that case they lose the pawn, and at least theoretically speaking, we would have the endgame rook and bishop versus rook, which is a theoretical draw. So this is definitely black's best shot here. In the game, after rook a5, Belia instead played bishop c4, and you can of course guess black's next move here. You have at least two good candidate moves. Which one would you pick? Aha. Either one is fine. The important thing is to attack the bishop before they take on a2. So in the game, black played rook a4. At this point, we have the same story here. Bishop takes a2, rook a3. We already saw this. Impossible for white to progress. Black should just make sure that they don't expose. I mean, if white plays something like king g2, make sure that we don't expose the king to check. Yeah, don't put the king on the light square, of course. In that case, white would give check with the bishop. Don't step on the f-file, because in that case, white could give check with the rook. So what you will have to do here is simply to move the rook somewhere, like rook a5, and then we could always come back to a3. It's always makes sense to keep an eye on the pawn on g3, of course. In the game, instead after rook a4, white played in the game bishop d3. Black continued with rook a3, the same policy of annoying white here, king e2, king h5. I think these moves are not that important. The situation itself, it's not favorable for white. g4, and I guess you could have taken that also, king takes g4. Yeah, he played king g5 in the game. And after king d2, king takes g4, bishop takes g6. Rook a7, later on white picked up that pawn, but black saved themselves in the rook and bishop versus rook endgame. So this is a nice tactical idea. Make your opponent self-pin. I have seen it several times, and I think I have used it also in some game perhaps. So important here not to let them take with the right piece. We should make them take with the wrong piece instead. That would be the point here for black, something like rook a3, cutting off the king. Okay, I wanted to talk a little about also pins which feature pawns. So these are the ones which are perhaps most difficult to spot in a game. I call them the hidden pin. Belongs to the family of hidden pins, pins that are not immediately visible for us. So in this game between with white pieces Brusson and playing black is Hakobian, black has just played here, I think, queen h4. Yeah, black just played queen h4. If we go back to the topic of chapter 1, detecting the threat, I would like you to put yourself in black's shoes here. And what do you think black has coming up here? Why did they put the queen on h4? In the first place, we would suspect that they would like to play h2, but that's actually not a big threat. We could just play king g2 and we have everything protected here in this position. So the threat is actually something else. A pawn like that is very useful in the tactical context. Black would be threatening to play rook takes e3 here. This is black's threat, and after f takes e3, there is queen g3, and you can see that there is queen g2 coming up next. So that's the big threat that white has to take care of here. We could, of course, react in mechanical fashion, play something like queen e2. However, in that case, bishop takes d4 would be annoying. We can get back to rook, the pawn, sorry, but yeah, the game gets more and more complex. Perhaps black can later on use this square and so on. Yeah, by the way, yeah, if you do this, I was just thinking, now I think h4 is stronger, right? h2, because now if we go king g2, they will take, and as you can see, we cannot take back because then they're queeny. So definitely this should be avoided. I see. So maybe queen d2, actually, it's more to the point, avoiding the pin along the e-file. But even in this case, black would have chances here. One move that I looked at was bishop f8, trying to trade off that bishop and possibly try to reroute the knight somehow to the attack. However, in the game, Brusson noticed a much nicer solution. So if I ask you the following question, which black pawn is pinned right now? One of the 7 pawn that black has in this position. If you remove it from the board, would lead to some great tactical difficulty. Which pawn am I talking about? Of course, we're talking about the c pawn. If the pawn was not there, then there is a rook falling off on c8. So that's what Brusson exploited in this case. He played this very beautiful move. Aha, you got it, bishop d6. Very pretty move. If the pawn was not on c6, c7, you would see this very quickly, no? Bring the bishop to the defense. But it's a little more difficult to spot when the pawn is there. But obviously the idea here is that c takes d6, rook takes c8. white wins the exchange. Actually, the game went like this. We can see very quickly what happened in the game. Black took back, and after rook takes c8, knight f8. White is winning here, completely winning. Extra exchange. Black's attack is not really convincing. White could proceed in different ways, but I like the way in which Brusson continued. He played in a very methodical fashion. In the first place, he played here queen f1. What's the point of this move? Well, the pawn is protected so that we can go king h2 in the next move. After that, he would like to take the pawn on h3. However, that could not be done because the pawn on f2 is hanging. So basically what white would like to do here is to play king h2, later protect his pawn. Which piece could protect that pawn? Well, the rook, definitely. So he would bring back the rook, and only then he would take the pawn on h3. So this kind of systematic thinking, I think it's sometimes like it's lost when you check engine evaluation and things like that. But strong grandmasters like Brusson, they are very good at this methodical thinking, go step by step, try to limit the dangers and risks and so on. So this is what happened in the game. Black played in the game bishop h6. Now we start with king h2. Yeah, by the way, there is maybe some issue with bishop takes e3, but probably not, but why not? Why even think about this? So king h2 first, and after king g7, Brusson simply continued with his plan, rook c2. You already know the idea, and after knight e6, queen takes h3. White was already the exchange and the pawn up, and they went on to win here without much difficulty. So very nice move, bishop d6, very pretty move. That's what I call the hidden pin. It's not a pin that it's immediately visible to us. So of course you could say that black is not forced to take on d6, but then somehow their position loses most of its charms. If you play something like knight f8 or any move, we would just safeguard the bishop here, bishop g3, and maybe then, once we have our king in safer shape, so to speak, we can start considering to take the pawn on c7, now that our bishop is helping the dark square defense. So nice shot, bishop d6. Please notice this pattern, and we will actually have a look at one last example featuring the same kind of idea. And this is, I'm afraid, one of my own games. It was played a long time ago. It's another Grunfeld battle. I didn't handle the opening very well in this game, where my opponent is Grandmaster Turov from Ukraine, I think. He has just played here bishop a6, I think. No, he has just played b4, sorry. I'm covering the bishop, and now, as you can see, I'm the exchange up, but my position is really critical because he's about to take on e2. After I move my rook, he will take on e2, and then he will take on c3. And black will be having a fork against two of white's pieces on e2 and on b1. So what do you think white should do about this? How could you possibly turn the tables here? I have used this as an exercise also with students, and it's not that evident, I would say, the answer. Rook d2, as you're suspecting, it's not the right choice because black would take, and no matter how you take back, we would play knight takes c3. And the same goes for rook. Yeah, where else can the rook go? Rook d1. Oh, to give away, that's another idea. Yeah, to give away the exchange like that. But I think there was a problem with this also. What was the problem with that? Bishop takes d3, rook takes c3. Yeah, we cannot take back next time, right? Because there is there is a pin, pins all over the place, right? If knight takes c3, black would take. Please notice the move order. Don't let them play bishop d2. And here we would play bishop b4. Another pin coming up. So this doesn't work. Perhaps you already saw the solution. If not, I'll give you a hint. It has to do something about this pin. So who is pinned at this point? Well, the pawn is pinned. The pawn cannot take, because in that case, black loses the rook. So this is what white can take advantage of. They can give away a pawn here. You're completely right. We can start with this move. Ugly looking move, of course. After bishop takes e4. I think by now you can also spot sorry, you can also spot the next move here, right? Looks like things got worse for white, but that's not entirely true. That's right, the pawn is still pinned, so there is another square that we can use. Aha, rook a3. Interesting, not so obvious. As I mentioned, Tactical tricks were always one of my favorite parts, especially when defending, and here I actually managed to save my skin. You can see the big point here is that, sorry, b takes a3, we take on b8, and there is also this threat for black to consider. If black prevents it, we are just in time to play knight c1. I think we're protecting the pawn, and we're having an extra change. It seems like black's initiative has come to a dead end here, so this should not be played with black. After rook a3, funny looking move, my opponent instead played bishop b5. Yeah, please notice, by the way, that this is also not working. Now bishop takes, king takes, knight c3. Evidently, if the pawn couldn't take in this way, it can't take in that way either, so we will just take and take on b8. But there was one variation that they could have tried. Yeah, let's see here. After rook a3, bishop b5, I went back with the rook. So here my opponent, perhaps he was psychologically surprised by what happened here, and he just settled for a draw. This is how the game ended. Now bishop c4, rook a3, and bishop e5. He didn't make any efforts to win this game. But there was an interesting possibility in this position. He could have tried the move knight c5. So in this case, black is like saying, okay, I don't go for that tactical motive anymore with bishop takes and knight c3, but I'm relying on my bishop pair and my potential passed pawn on the b file. So this was an interesting variation, because after bishop takes, as you know, the bishop pair is extremely strong in the endgame, so this is definitely something that white should be careful about. Still, the pin is around. There is still a pinning motive on the b file, and that's what white could use here. Interesting move for white. What do you think? How should white somehow try to soften up the position here, try to liberate themselves from black's pressure? How could that be done? You're right. This move is very clever here. The move a3 is very clever. In the first place, we should notice that if black takes, there is no such thing as, let's see here, rook takes, and if you go a2, I'm trying to remember what happens here. Oh, but this is actually dangerous, no? Yeah, we can't play like that. Rook takes a5 to stop the pawn, bishop b4. We should always be respectful about the opponent's passed pawn. So yeah, don't play like that. I was actually making a big mistake here. So after b takes a3, that's a forbidden move. Rook takes b5, but there is a better move here. Aha, there is a piece that we haven't talked so much about so far in this example, and now it's time to use it. Aha, knight c3. We are now definitely about to take, because our knight is taking care of the pawn. So black would play here bishop b4. Obviously, in this kind of situation, we should always have the mindset that we can give back the material at some point. And that's what we should do at this point. Rook takes b4, a takes b4, rook takes b4. Still a little tricky. Black is a pawn up, and they have chances of advancing that pawn. But okay, there is a pin also. I think there was not any real convincing way for black to play here. Rook c8, that's the most tricky move. You can see that there is still a pitfall here for white to escape. Please don't take with a knight on b5, because in that case, black will play a2, and I think the threat of rook c1 and a1 leads to the win of the exchange. Aha, so we cannot play like that. But after rook c8, we can play simply rook b3, getting ready to take on a3. This would evaporate into a draw after something like a2 and knight takes, rook c2, rook takes b5, rook takes a2, and perhaps simply king f1 with a dead draw, so to speak. Tricky variation. This is something that white could have faced if black had opted for this more ambitious move, knight c5. So in that case, we should take and try to soften up black's initiative by playing a3, and always plays the mindset of giving back the exchange. It's not realistic to think that we can keep the extra exchange when black has this passed pawn and the powerful bishop pair. So, well, what was this example about? Basically, white were facing a difficult situation here. They were about to lose material and end up in an ugly endgame, but using this pin along the b file, starting with c4, they managed to keep the balance here. c4, bishop takes c4, rook a3. It's all about the pin along the b file. Obviously, this would never work if the rook was somewhere else, but here it works. We're very fortunate that we have this pin to use. Aha, so rook bishop b5, rook b3, and white is trying to play a3 here at the right moment. So that's what this interesting example is about. I think that was the last example. We have seen several cases of how we can use pins to help our defensive task. The first example we saw was this one, where black quickly noticed this plan of rook d4, rook h4, exploiting the pin along the h1, a8 diagonal. In our second example, this was a much more critical task for white. They really had to take on e4 and play this move knight d5. Tricky move in order to go for a pin along the d file. If black takes, then this would be the key situation here. Now it's white who is pinning black, and yeah, black would be in big troubles. In our next example, something similar happened on the d file. If you remember, this was like the emerging position. It started like that, Grunfeld position, where blacks would castle. Yeah, that's a very complex opening. Bishop c5 and knight takes d5. Looks like impossible that this will work, but it actually works because white has problems resisting on the d file. They don't have a good way to defend this bishop on d5. We saw a pin taking place on a rank. Here, Solak played rook d4, which meant that black's attack had come to a dead end because the queen would like to stay on g4, but in that case, they cannot take on f3 anymore. We saw the tricky example where black was faced with a difficult task. It seemed white's rook was ready to invade. They would love to bring the rook to c8 to pin black along the 8th rank. However, black noticed this clever move, bishop takes d6. Always look beyond what you see originally, please. Rook d1, and we have this nice move, king e6, turning the tables, making the pin work against white. And we had an example very similar. We are trying to reach this situation where white's pieces are very unfortunately placed. They will be placed better basically in any other way. For this to happen, we should make sure that we don't let them take with a rook. We should try to make them take with a bishop instead. And for that reason, we should attack the bishop. Like if they go somewhere, we should just continue to attack it and so on until they take. And then we're happy that, yeah, we can put a rook here, that they cannot easily move. The pin works against white again. We had the example of the pawn being pinned, the pawn on c7, the hidden pin, so to speak. White quickly took advantage of this situation by playing bishop d6. From my personal experience, such moves are often overlooked in the calculation, so please notice this pattern, and we're very happy to bring the bishop to g3. We are relying on the pin along the c file. The rook on c8 is exposed. Something similar happened in my game. I played here c4 because I knew that after bishop takes c4, I could play rook a3, relying on the pin along the b file, right? And I'm having some kind of counterattack here on the a file, so he would have to do something about that. For example, bishop e5, and then I could just stay here. And in this way, I'm preventing his key plan of knight c3, because in that case, I could take, and in the end, I take on b8. So that's about using pins here with c4, having this funny move at our disposal, rook a3. All right, thanks a lot, and see you in the next chapter.